Here's a question that will change how you see global economics forever. What happens when the most powerful nation on Earth runs out of money, and the only solution involves becoming the world's largest drug cartel? This isn't a hypothetical. In 1839, the British Treasury was staring at something terrifying. Their silver reserves were vanishing, not slowly, hemorrhaging. Every year, ships left London carrying 28 million ounces of silver bullion to China, and they came back with leaves. Now here's the detail that most people miss, and pay attention because this explains everything that came next. The British weren't just buying a luxury product. Tea had become infrastructure. It was the caffeine that powered 14-hour factory shifts during the Industrial Revolution. It was taxed so heavily that it funded a quarter of the Royal Navy. Without tea, the machines stopped. Without tea, the ships didn't sail. But there's a problem that made British bankers wake up in cold sweats. And it has to do with what the Chinese emperor didn't want. See, trade only works when both sides want something. The British had wool. The Chinese wore silk. The British had clocks. Chinese astronomers had mapped the heavens while Britons were still living in mud huts. The British had textiles. China had been mass-producing porcelain for 800 years. The Qing emperor looked at every product Britain could offer and said 4 words: "We possess all things." He would accept exactly one form of payment: silver. Cold, heavy, limited silver. Think about what this means. It's like if Apple today could only buy semiconductors from one country, and that country only accepted payment in gold bars. Eventually, you run out of gold bars. By the 1830s, the Bank of England's reserves had dropped by 40%. The pound was destabilizing. Parliament was in crisis sessions. The empire wasn't dying from war. It was dying from shopping. But here's where it gets dark. The East India Company, which, remember, was basically the British government wearing a corporate mask, sat down and asked themselves one question: what product could bypass Chinese logic entirely? What could they sell that wouldn't compete with silk or porcelain, because it wouldn't compete with anything? Something that would tap directly into human biology itself? They found their answer growing in the conquered fields of Bengal. Now, most people hear opium trade and picture pirates and criminals, shadowy figures in back alleys. That's not what this was, and this is the detail that should genuinely disturb you. The British didn't allow opium production. They industrialized it. They applied the same organizational genius that built their textile mills to manufacturing narcotics. In the Bengal region of India, colonial administrators forced farmers, at gunpoint if necessary, to plow over their rice and wheat and plant poppies instead. We have records of entire districts where food crops vanished and purple flowers stretched to the horizon. The processing facilities at Patna and Ghazipur weren't hidden warehouses. They were cathedrals of narcotics. Visitors described thousands of clay jars stacked floor to ceiling, each containing pure black opium paste. They described the smell that hung over entire districts: sickly sweet, impossible to escape. And here's the detail that still amazes me. Every single ball of opium was standardized to exactly 1.75 pounds. Every cake was stamped with the official seal of the East India Company, the same way they'd stamp a gold bar or a crate of rifles. This wasn't crime, this was manufacturing. But the British faced a legal problem. Selling opium in China was punishable by death, strangulation specifically. The British government couldn't be seen directly violating Chinese law, so they built something brilliant, something that would make modern money launderers jealous. The East India Company grew and processed the drugs. Then they sold them at public auctions in Calcutta to private merchants. These merchants, technically independent businessmen, loaded the opium onto armed clipper ships and sailed them to China. It's like if the CIA manufactured cocaine in Colombia, then sold it at auction to private contractors who happened to smuggle it into America. Technically, the government's hands are clean. Remember this name, William Jardine. We'll come back to him, because what happened to this man after the war tells you everything about how power really works. Jardine was a Scottish surgeon who realized that healing people paid pennies compared to poisoning them. He and his partner James Matheson anchored their ships off Linton Island and turned them into floating drug warehouses. They bribed Chinese port officials. They armed local gangs. They created a distribution network that would make modern cartels look amateur. And the silver came flooding back. Here's where we need to talk specifics. because vague numbers hide the scale of what happened. In 1800, the British were smuggling about 2,000 chests of opium into China annually. By 1838, 40,000 chests. That's approximately 5.6 million pounds of pure narcotic paste. The silver flow reversed. China, which had been accumulating silver for centuries, started bleeding wealth. The British trade deficit didn't just disappear, it flipped into a massive surplus. The empire was saved. The Bank of England stabilized. Victorian Britain entered its golden age. But think about what funded that golden age for a second. Every mile of British railway track laid in this period. Opium money, the civil servants administering India, opium salaries, the navy that patrolled every ocean, opium cannons, the Pax Britannica, that era of British peace your textbooks celebrate, was underwritten by the destruction of Chinese society. Now here's where the story takes a turn that most Western historians skip past quickly, because this part doesn't make Britain look like the hero. In 1839, the Chinese emperor had finally had enough. He appointed a man named Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner with one mission: end the opium plague by any means necessary. Lin Zexu was incorruptible, which was rare in the late Qing bureaucracy. He arrived in Canton and immediately did something the British never expected. He wrote a letter, not to the smugglers, to Queen Victoria herself. And this letter, I want to read you a fragment because it's one of the most remarkable diplomatic documents ever written. He appealed to her conscience. He asked how she would feel if Chinese merchants sailed to England and poisoned her people. He pointed out that opium was illegal in Britain itself, so why was she allowing it to be exported to China? The letter never received a response. We don't know if Victoria ever even saw it. But what Lin Zexu did next triggered the war. He rounded up 20,000 chests of British opium, over 2.6 million pounds, and destroyed it. The process took workers 23 days. They mixed it with lime and salt and flushed it into the sea. The British merchants watched their profits dissolve into the Pearl River, and they were furious. What happened next reveals the real face of empire. The British government had a choice. They could accept that their citizens had been breaking Chinese law, and that China had every right to enforce its own sovereignty, or they could go to war. The debate in Parliament was actually closer than you'd expect. William Gladstone, future Prime Minister, stood up and called it shameful, unjust, and calculated to cover Britain in permanent disgrace. The war authorization passed by just 9 votes. 9 votes to decide the fate of a civilization. But even the opponents made arguments that tell you how the British really saw the world. They weren't opposed to the opium trade on moral grounds. They were worried about logistics, about whether Britain could actually win. None of them questioned whether Britain had the right to force another nation to accept its poison. And here's the technological detail that made this war inevitable. The British deployed a ship called the HMS Nemesis. It was the world's first iron-hulled, steam-powered warship. It could sail against the wind. It could navigate shallow rivers where traditional ships couldn't go. To Chinese defenders watching from the coast, it must have looked like something from a nightmare. Their navy consisted of wooden junks powered by oars, armed with cannons that hadn't significantly changed in 300 years. The Chinese had brave soldiers. They had generals who'd studied warfare their entire lives, but they were fighting with medieval technology against the Industrial Revolution. The British cannonballs punched through wooden walls. The Chinese cannonballs bounced off iron hulls. British accounts describe Chinese soldiers standing their ground until they were literally cut down where they stood. Matchlock muskets against rifle volleys. It wasn't a war, it was a slaughter. By 1842, British gunboats had sailed up the Yangtze River and aimed their cannons at Nanjing. They threatened to burn the city unless the emperor surrendered. He surrendered. The Treaty of Nanking, which China calls the first of the unequal treaties, was signed aboard a British warship. The terms were dictated at gunpoint, and they were designed to humiliate. China would pay $21 million in silver. $6 million of those dollars were specifically compensation for the opium Lin Zexu had destroyed. Let that sink in. The Chinese government was forced to pay for the drugs that had been smuggled into their country against their own laws. But the money wasn't even the worst part. The treaty forced China to open 5 treaty ports where British citizens could live and operate beyond Chinese law, and it forced the emperor to cede a rocky island to Britain forever. That island was Hong Kong. Lord Palmerston, the British Foreign Secretary, was actually furious about Hong Kong. He called it a barren rock with barely a house upon it. He'd wanted something valuable, but the smugglers knew better. Hong Kong was the perfect operational base. Under the Union Jack, they could build warehouses, dock ships, and distribute drugs without any fear of Chinese police. Hong Kong became the headquarters of the cartel. After the treaty, did the opium trade slow down? It multiplied. With legal protection and forced market access, British exports to China went from 40,000 chests annually to over 100,000 by the 1880s. They were shipping 6,600 tons of pure opium every single year. Conservative estimates suggest that by 1900, between 40 to 100 million Chinese people were addicted. That's roughly a quarter of the adult male population in some provinces. Entire villages stopped functioning. Tax revenues collapsed because workers couldn't work. The military couldn't recruit because young men were too weak to carry rifles. The Chinese called what followed the century of humiliation. 100 years of internal collapse, civil war, and foreign domination, all triggered by a war fought to protect drug dealers. Remember that name I asked you to keep in mind? William Jardine, the Scottish surgeon turned drug lord? Here's what happened to him after the war he lobbied for succeeded. He returned to London a hero. He was elected to Parliament. He was celebrated in society. His partner, James Matheson, became a baronet. Actual British nobility. And the company they founded? Jardine, Matheson and Company didn't disappear into history. It evolved. It moved from opium into shipping, real estate, and finance. If you walk through Hong Kong's financial district today, you'll see Jardine House, a landmark skyscraper with its distinctive circular windows, looking out over the harbour that once held opium clippers. You'll see streets named after the smugglers. The glittering prosperity of one of the world's great financial capitals is built on a foundation laid by the cartel. And this brings us to why this story matters now. When Chinese leaders today talk about national rejuvenation or warn against foreign interference, they're not speaking in abstract political terms. They're remembering the Opium Wars. They teach it in every school. It's foundational mythology. The moment the West revealed its true nature, every trade negotiation, every diplomatic tension, every discussion about Taiwan or Hong Kong or the South China Sea has this ghost sitting in the room. The question isn't spoken, but it's always there. Will they do it again? The British eventually stopped the opium trade, but not because they found a conscience. By the early 1900s, they'd found other ways to make money, and domestic reformers had become politically powerful enough to force change. The damage was done. 100 years of it. So what does this story actually teach us? It teaches us that the line between a legitimate government and a criminal enterprise is sometimes just who has the bigger navy. It teaches us that free trade can be weaponized, that the same people who lecture about open markets will send gunboats when markets don't open in their favor. It teaches us that national debt doesn't disappear, it gets solved, and the methods used to solve it often create consequences that last for centuries. The Pax Britannica wasn't funded by superior culture or divine favor, it was funded by addiction. The railways and universities and museums were built with silver drained from a dying empire on the other side of the world. Queen Victoria sat on her throne for 63 years, the symbol of virtue and moral fortitude that still hangs in museums today. But the jewels in her crown were polished with silver extracted through organized addiction. The tea in her cup was paid for with the destruction of a civilization. And here's the question that should keep you up at night. What comfortable prosperity that we enjoy today is being funded by suffering we've been trained not to see? If this changed how you think about empire, economics, or the stories we tell ourselves about civilization, you'll want to see what I'm covering next. Because the Opium Wars were just the first chapter in a much longer story, and the sequel is still being written.